That was Julian Pollock, Berkeley High School product. Julian Pollock is only about 4 years out of Berkeley High, and he's pretty good. Today we'll talk about injurious speech, which is my term. You won't find that in any texts anyplace. And by injurious speech, I mean speech that hurts, speech that injures people in various ways, other than in their reputation. That is speech that is not the subject of a libel suit, but that injures people or is highly offensive in some other way. And here we'll encounter the third respect in which speech is better protected in this country than in other countries. The first two are the rule against prior restraints, and secondly, New York Times versus Sullivan rule that public officials and public figures can't sue for criticism of their behavior in office. And the third is the right that we have under the First Amendment, as interpreted in these injurious speech cases, principally Brandenburg versus Ohio, to advocate bad ideas, offensive ideas, harmful ideas. And this third respect, in which our speech is freer than elsewhere, is clearly the most fragile of the three, for reasons that we'll discuss when we get to Brandenburg. To start off this discussion, we consider the epic drama of the Reverend Jerry Falwell against Larry Flynt and the Hustler magazine, Flynt being the world's leading pornographer, and Falwell was the leader of the moral majority, a prime mover on the religious right, a frequent critic of pornography, frequent critic of Larry Flynt, and Flynt, of course, detested Falwell and his politics. And Flynt published the ad that you have in the reader so that you can actually see what it says, which was a parody of an ad campaign run by Campari, the Italian liquor, whatever it is, at the time, in which the Campari ads would interview celebrities about their first time, hinting that it's the first time they ever had sex, but by the end of the interview you'd learn that it was the first time they tried Campari, which was a similarly orgasmic experience for them. And instead of advertising Campari, Flynt did a whole page right inside the cover on Jerry Falwell with Falwell's picture, and a fake interview with Falwell, in which he says, "My first time was in an outhouse with his mom, and it was smelly and ugly, but they got drunk." And Falwell says, "Mom looked better than a Baptist whore with a $100 donation." He ends up saying, "I always get sloshed before I go out to the pulpit. You don't think I could lay down all that bullshit sober, do you?" In microscopic type, at the very bottom of the ad, it says, "Ad parody not to be taken seriously." Well, Falwell took it seriously and sued Hustler and Flynt for many millions of dollars, and made three claims when he filed suit in federal court in Virginia: libel, the appropriation of Falwell's name or likeness for commercial purposes, which is a species of private privacy law that's very specialized and we won't get into much, and it did not go anywhere in Falwell's case. That claim was dismissed, largely because Falwell himself, when he saw the ad, had it duplicated hundreds of thousands of times and put it in a direct mail campaign to people that he thought would support him. His pitch was, this is the depths to which the pornographers will go to attack me in this mean-spirited, ugly, vicious way. And he, in fact, netted $800,000 as a result of that campaign. So he was not in a good position to claim that Flynt had misappropriated his likeness for commercial purposes. That claim was dismissed in court, leaving two claims surviving. One of them was, here's the way Flynt looked in those days with the thing. He was quite gleeful about it. The two claims were libel that went to the jury, and the intentional infliction of emotional distress, which is another tort. It's one that grew up in the 20th century. Common law courts decided that damages could be awarded to people who were the victims of intentional infliction of emotional distress. And the elements of the tort, as they developed through the 20th century, were the three that I put on the board. That is, there has to be intentional conduct by somebody, not negligent, intentional conduct that offends generally accepted standards of decency or morality, or in shorthand, is outrageous. Some courts just say the second element is outrageousness, outrageous and intentional conduct. And this conduct must cause, in fact, severe emotional distress. That's what Falwell claimed.
You know how he is. I don't know how they...
And the case went to the jury on those two claims. And we will see how it played out before the jury in an actual Hollywood movie right here in this academic setting. And I use it because it is so accurate. About a dozen years or so ago, they made a movie called The People versus Larry Flynt, which is a pretty good movie, actually. It stars Woody Harrelson playing Flynt, and Edward Norton playing his lawyer, and Courtney Love playing his girlfriend wife. And the movie recounts fairly accurately the adventures of Larry Flynt in his lifetime. He's still, of course, alive and publishing, and makes lots of dirty videos and stuff like that. But he was principally known as the publisher of Hustler magazine and some other sexually oriented magazines. Anyway, he had some adventures in court. Larry Flynt did. He was held in contempt a few times and jailed. He was sued for libel. He always won the cases. He was sued over a regular column that he had in Hustler magazine called Asshole of the Month, in which he would select some public official or public figure and just excoriate them for bad behavior having nothing to do with sex. It was political. But he would get sued for libel or other claims there, just as he was sued by Jerry Falwell about this ad. Anyway, this movie includes the trial of the Falwell case, and they don't make up the dialogue. This is not a screenwriter writing these words. This is right out of the transcript of the trial. This is what actually happened at the trial. And then the case goes to the Supreme Court of the United States, and again, the movie accurately captures what was actually said in the argument in the Supreme Court. So we start with Flint is in jail for contempt of court. And he's also strung out. He abused various drugs, and he was not entirely competent at the time. And so it's a little vague. But we start with Edward Norton, his lawyer, Courtney Love, as his wife, talking to Courtney, saying, "You got to help us." What's going on here? Yeah. Flint wants to establish that Falwell is a public figure. Why? To deal with the libel claim. What's the consequence of being a public figure? So Falwell would have to prove actual malice under the Sullivan Rule. Falwell is definitely an all-purpose, pervasive public figure, and he's quite happy to embrace that category. He's proud of the fact that he's nationally famous. The lawyer for Falwell, who was just cross-examining Flint, is not an actor. He's a lawyer by the name of Bert Newborn, who was a professor at NYU Law School, and for a long time was an ACLU lawyer in New York. He does a pretty good job as an actor. Well, the jury verdict came back with Falwell losing his libel claim, largely because of the judge's instructions to the jury that said if no reasonable reader of this fake ad would believe that it was factual in any way, that Falwell had sex with his mom in an outhouse, then it can't be the subject of a libel suit, because libel suits involve false statements of fact. And the jury concluded that no reasonable reader would have thought this was factual, and therefore ruled against Falwell on the libel claim, but they found for him, brought back a verdict of $100,000 in compensatory damages on the claim of intentional infliction of emotional distress, plus another $100,000 in punitive damages. So the total judgment against Flint and the magazine was $200,000. And Flint and the magazine took the case to the United States Supreme Court, which, of course, was in the late 80s, so it's a different cast of characters than we have now, but included, for example, Scalia. And in the movie, they've got actors who look pretty much like the actual justices, and certainly what they say is right out of the transcript of the Supreme Court argument. Mr. Keating that they just referred to is Charles Keating, who at the time of these events was a real estate wheeler-dealer in Cincinnati, but basically a full-time anti-pornography crusader who allied himself with Falwell. And then he moved to Arizona, and he became a big-time player in the savings and loan industry, and was a main contributor to the crash of the savings and loan industry, and caused a huge federal bailout of the industry. And Keating went to prison for securities fraud ultimately. The movie did not include the argument on behalf of Falwell, and the lawyer, Norman Gluttman is his name, his real name, opened his argument by saying, "Deliberate, malicious character assassination is not protected by the First Amendment, even if no one believes the statements." The opinion in the case for a unanimous court was written by the Chief Justice at the time, William Rehnquist, who was not a big First Amendment justice. This is, in my view, the only decent First Amendment opinion he wrote during his entire tenure on the court, and it was indeed a very good one. Rehnquist was a Gilbert and Sullivan fan, as well as a history buff, but he decided at some point during his tenure that he would put stripes on his robe. So he put stripes on his robe, sort of like an English judge. None of the other justices ever did that. Well, Rehnquist starts off his opinion by framing the issue this way. Questions whether a public figure can recover damages for emotional harm. Falwell testified, you've got some parts of it about his mother and how important their relationship was and so on, and that it really wounded him emotionally to have his mother being accused along with him of having sex with him and so on. Anyway, whether a public figure can recover damages for emotional harm caused by publication of an ad parody that is offensive to him and doubtless gross and repugnant in the eyes of most. In other words, they're not trying to sugarcoat this vicious, dirty joke that Flint is playing on Falwell, taking it on head on. Then Rehnquist, after stating the issue forthrightly, launches into this rhapsodic treatment of our First Amendment freedoms, talking about the marketplace of ideas, quoting Oliver Wendell Holmes' great opinion that established that concept back in 1919 in the Abrams case, and working through the Sullivan Rule, emphasizing the fact that our public discourse should be robust and uninhibited, and so on. And then takes on Falwell's argument that, well, this case is different from libel cases, because what you have here, the gravamen of the tort, the gist of what Falwell's claim is that Flint intended to cause injury. He had a very bad, blameworthy motive. And that differentiates this case from the usual libel situation in which mistakes are made in the discussion of public officials and figures. Rehnquist says, though, in the world of public affairs, many things done with motives less than admirable are protected by the First Amendment. And our debate couldn't be uninhibited if the speaker had to run the risk that it might later be proved that he spoke out of ill will or some other kind of unworthy motive. Thus, Rehnquist says, while a bad motive may be deemed controlling in other areas of the law, we think the First Amendment prohibits liability in the area of public debate about public officials. And then he reasons, if it were otherwise, if public figures and public officials could sue because their feelings were hurt by somebody who wanted to hurt their feelings, then political cartooning would be at risk. And this is one of the instances in which the filing of an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, in the Supreme Court made a real noticeable difference. The American Association of Political Cartoonists, or something, editorial cartoonists, something like that, filed an amicus brief in the case, which didn't have much text to it, but had an appendix in the brief with reproductions of great American political cartoons from the beginning up to date, including George Washington being portrayed as an ass, and the Tweed Gang in 19th century New York being shown as vultures, leading up to Reagan's Secretary of the Interior was a man named James Watt, who really didn't believe in conservation of our natural resources at all, and there was a political cartoon of him with a stuffed taxidermy head of Bambi on his office wall. And all of these political cartoons were pointed attacks on those public figures and public officials. They were, in some instances, quite vicious, but part of a tradition of political cartooning that has enlivened our national discourse. And Reagan discusses these cartoons and says that our political discourse would have been considerably poorer without them. Falwell then rejoins, yes, but what Flint did to me is so outrageous that it differentiates what he did from this tradition of political cartooning, from traditional public cartoons. And Rehnquist agrees that this ad parody, the fake Falwell one, is at best a distant cousin of political cartoons and a rather poor relation at that. What's wrong with using outrageousness as the standard to differentiate what happened to Falwell from these political cartoons? Walter? Well, isn't that what we had juries for, to bring the conscience of the community to bear and to bring the values and beliefs of the community to bear? Isn't that a good thing rather than a bad thing? Mark?
I mean, if it's outrageous, it's so incredibly vague, and that means that if maybe someone had sex with their mother in an outhouse is outrageous, then almost anything else below that would not be outrageous. There's no real barrier of what is not, and there's no real concrete thing that saying someone, I don't know, like most minor things be considered outrageous if it's starting to be big to that. That's what happened.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I think it's interesting, because I mean, thinking back to the case where the son that was in the military died, and they had the whole son died of life. That seems like it would be more emotional, cause more emotional distress than this did. But because it's not like a personal attack, it doesn't come close. So I think the whole outrageous, this thing is way too broad, because something can be outrageous and cause emotional distress, but if it's not personal, then it doesn't count. But in a case like this, where he's obviously a public figure, it's obviously something that's no one takes seriously, and people that are reading Hustler probably are going to this church anyways.
Whether people take it seriously or not is not part of the tort. You know, the tort is intentionally inflicting emotional harm on somebody by outrageous conduct. This tort is the same one as in the funeral protest case. The father of the killed soldier, one of his claims was intentional infliction of emotional distress, which he won, but the First Amendment trumped. Well, Rehnquist identifies the same things that you did, basically viewing it as an unduly subjective standard. Rehnquist says that if it were possible to lay down a principled standard to distinguish between this kind of vicious attack and the political cartoons that we want to preserve, maybe our public discourse wouldn't suffer. But he can't think of a principled standard that would do that. I don't know, maybe you can. But outrageousness is definitely not one because of its inherent subjectivity that allows the jury, as Walter points out, to award damages based on its tastes and its dislike either of the speech or of the speaker, which is inherently perilous to free speech. Well, Scalia had said, de gustibus non est disputandum, for you Latin speakers, there's no disputing taste, in an obscenity case, Polk versus Illinois, years before. But it wasn't an opinion for the court. It was a concurring opinion, maybe even a dissenting. It was a concurring opinion in Polk, in which he said it's not the law of the land. It's just a phrase that came out in his opinion, saying we shouldn't get involved in matters of taste. But here, Rehnquist is emphasizing that by saying we can't allow jurors' tastes to result in the punishment of speech about public figures. And he says the court's never allowed liability because speech may have an adverse emotional impact on its audience, which harks back to the Jehovah's Witnesses cases, where the fact that the speech may alienate, offend the audience is not a reason for suppressing it. Rehnquist says the fact that society